What's up guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk about the issues I have with WoW's current talent tree model. War Within will be our second full expansion with the current talent trees. At the end of Shadowlands, we traded in our 7-row, 3 choice per row talent tree system that we had had since Mists of Pandaria for what you currently see here, which were an upgrade to what we were dealing with for character customization for the last 4 expansions. And as far as I'm concerned, and most of the feedback I saw in the last 2 expansions was these were generally pretty well received. That said, there were some obvious flaws with these talent trees from the get-go. At the very basic level, they took away most of your character's abilities and passives and threw them in the tree. Honestly, it feels like most of this is there so that somebody can have a button to click on their talent tree every time they level up. I do think that causes a lot of bloat in the trees, mostly the class trees, and in that regard it felt like a high school student trying to meet a word count for an essay. They have put a lot of additional work into the talent trees. That's awesome and I love to see that. I do like the potential that the trees have for making decisions about your character, but I do think a lot of things in the trees make it so that you don't get to make those decisions. So I'm just going to point out things that I consider to be poor talents, things that waste space in the tree, things that clutter the tree, things that should just be returned to default talents, as well as point out things that I like about the tree, and overall stuff that I think would lower the barrier of entry for players designing their own talent trees. The number one thing I don't like about talent trees is when there's a mandatory talent. And I'm not saying previous iterations of talent trees were perfect. The 7-row tree certainly had its share of mandatory talents. The spec trees are way more throughput focused, and so for any given scenario, there is going to be a more correct answer. But I think the class trees had the most potential for people to make decisions based on how they want to play the game, regarding utility, movement speed, CC, and defensive options. And currently, I don't think they accomplished that, so I really wish every class with a Dispel would have those returned to their baseline kit. It's certainly annoying when you have somebody that didn't spec into their Dispel for a fight. In a raid, you can always just wipe and repull. In Mythic Plus, it's certainly more costly of a mistake as you have to run out to respec. And I think the only benefit you actually get from having this node on the class tree is that you get to move that point to somewhere else in that first third of the tree, which either has mandatory talents or talents of little consequence. I do think talents that alter stuff in our baseline kit, even to a small degree, are good talents. You know, like adding a heal to your cleanse. It makes it feel a little less bad to cleanse. Healers can be competitive, just like DPS. You can maybe even alter this to do more healing upon increasing number of successful dispels. Nothing too crazy, right? I think Hammer of Wrath is silly to have to put a point into. There's nobody that's using a build in any competitive content that isn't taking Hammer of Wrath. I know the devs certainly put some thought into creating the class trees with this, like, you know, we have Holy on the left, Prot in the middle, Ret on the right. And I think that's cool, and I can understand what they're going for, but I think, like, oh, you have to put a point into Hammer of Wrath. That's kind of a silly thing. Nobody's not taking that talent. I think speccing into actual CC is certainly a better form of a talent than speccing into your Cleanse Toxin or Rebuke, right? Especially hard CC, typically less used, so not as mandatory as the other 2 types of talents. And then you have like Repentance and Blinding Light. I think choice nodes are great, pretty much all around. There are some choice nodes that still aren't choices. There's a good example below here. Then you have a follow-up talent that works for either of the choice node talents, which I think is kind of neat. It turns Repentance into something that you can spam, shaves a little bit of cooldown off Blinding Light. Then you have Greater Judgment. This is another mandatory talent if we're being realistic. Judgment causes the target to take increased damage from your spenders. This is not really a decision anyone's making. You either spec that point into it or you're trolling. Same thing with Rebuke. I understand a lot of people might like being able to spec out of your interrupt, but just like Cleanse, not a big fan of that. I do like, again, the follow-up talent, successfully interrupting the enemy with Rebuke or Avenger Shield for Prot. Cast the Hammer of the Righteous, best damage and resources. I think any talent that encourages use of your interrupt is great. I think spending 2 points on an interrupt in class tree is just an example of like bloat for the tree. Just give people their interrupt back, especially since you took Skull Bash off the Druid class tree for Boomy. You don't have to worry about them getting 2 interrupts now. They don't have to go out of their way to spend a bunch of points to do it. I've never mid-fight heard someone say, I'm glad I got to spec out of my interrupt because now I can do this. But what I have heard is, oh, I don't have my interrupter, oh, I don't have my dispel. It's probably more often talked about as a point of failure than a point of, oh, you did something right. Now for Prot, Divine Steed is a gimme. I think Divine Steed is another example of a talent you should just put back in the baseline kit. And I'm not saying that fix the Prot tree and don't do the same for other trees. We're just using this one example. Otherwise, the video would be 3 hours long. Divine Spurs is kind of cool. Paladin Charger is typically fast enough and long enough duration to get you wherever you need to go. At the very least, it's a trade-off ability where you get a benefit and there's some takeaway from it. And then you have Blessing of Freedom choice node, and I think this is actually good. If this was just Blessing of Freedom, I would feel kind of okay about it. Okay, it's utility. You don't have to have it. Not speccing into it would likely be less of a pitfall than not taking your interrupt or your dispel. We really are just talking utility here, but they have done something neat here, and I want to give them credit when I do think they've done something neat. they've given you the option of, instead of taking Blessing of Freedom, just tying Blessing of Freedom to your charger. This is less efficient than having Blessing of Freedom, but what you are doing is reducing button bloat. And I think there are people that struggle with their keybinds in the game, and having an option to maybe be less efficient but still have access to this ability, if they know they need it for a raid fight or something, they can say, hey, I can just hit my charger ability and then we're good to go. And in that regard, I think it's an accessibility decision that people can make. I didn't talk about Turn Evil, but yeah, having a spec into a hard CC button I think is okay. So putting a point into it when you need it is cool, and not having it for the most time is probably cool as well. I do like the follow-up node, even though it does mean that you'd be putting 2 points into Turn Evil. You know, Turn Evil now affects 5 additional enemies. I've yet to see the scenario where this is going to be really cool, but it probably exists already. And then the choice node with that is Turn Evil's cast time is reduced by 100%, making it an instant cast. This is super useful in the Prot Paladin Mage Tower, and it's likely useful to a degree in PvP. Imperial Ward is a modifier for Lay on Hands. Again, this is not a mandatory talent, you already have the Lay on Hands, but it does give increased armor, which is thematic for, you know, you giving it to a tank. And it also allows you to ignore healing reduction effects. I use this on Queen and Sarek in the first tier of War Within. This was a great button. You could just full heal yourself after the swap and you'd be good to go. It adds a nice additional utility effect to the spell. Ret Paladin though does have to spec into Lay on Hands. I think that's silly. I'd just give it back baseline. But they clearly had this idea of, oh, we'll make Prot and Holy by Hammer of Wrath, and then we'll just make Ret by Lay on Hands, so that we don't give any of the specs like the 3 first talents. I think Divine Toll being a talent that you have to put a point into is super lame. I think they should just take this out and replace it with this choice node down here, Divine Resonance or Quickened Invocation. There's certainly uses for either one of these talents. I know Quickened Invocation was very useful for the underpin so that Divine Toll would line up for every shield. And Divine Resonance was one of the better Shadowlands legendaries. It just spits out an Avenger shield every 5 seconds after you use Divine Toll. And I think they got away with it a little bit because Divine Toll was initially in the protection tree, and you couldn't get it for Holy and Ret. And that was in the first tier, Dragonflight. They fixed that pretty quick. Maybe it also went into the second tier. But then people were like, oh my god, we got Divine Toll back, thank god, I'm going to spec into it. I'm really not a fan of specking into powerful cooldowns. I hate the warrior class tree for this reason. You're just trying to get to the bottom and then you're min-maxing the bottom of the class tree just like you would the bottom of the spec tree. I think it's kind of dumb. But next to it, we do have another cool ability, I think. Unbound Freedom, it gives you movement speed on Blessing of Freedom, which is awesome, but it also allows you to share Blessing of Freedom. You put it on somebody else, you get it as well, and even if you put it on yourself, you're going to give it to your nearest ally. I think that's an accessibility option too for people that allows them not to have to target another player. So cool effect there, and with that, Paladin becomes a pretty mobile class in a lot of content. Blessing of Freedom is a shorter cooldown than Paladin Charger, so you can use that when you want some movement speed but still want to save your charger for something else. And it gives you more group support in that you can give movement speed to other players. Love this talent. This is a great example of a class talent. Sanctified Plates I kind of hate, because as a tank you never really want to pass up armor increase or stamina. What I really don't like about it is that it's 2 points. I would say reduce it to 1 point, take out the armor and stamina increase, bake that into Prot itself, maybe leave the stamina increase there for Ret and Holy, because some of these talents do change based on what spec you're playing, and maybe for Prot just increase the AoE damage reduction, which would feel a little bit more optional. Consecrated Ground, this is another talent that moved over from the protection tree. It was over here. We got Refining Fire instead, which is like a super solid damage talent. Increases the size of Consecrate and adds a snare to it. A fine example of utility that you won't always need, and for dungeons it's likely just a damage increase, maybe a little bit less so in raids, but a button you could feel comfortable speccing out of and not having that benefit. Divine Reach, increased range on your auras. This is okay, it doesn't feel mandatory, but still probably very useful in PvP in general and raiding, right? Especially for Holy Paladin when you're gonna Aura Mastery and we no longer have Rule of Law for that, right? Blessing of Sacrifice and Blessing of Protection. Utility, stuff that you're not always going to need. I think plenty of players are happy to spec out a Blessing of Protection, but what I don't like here is that at least one of these is required to get down to Divine Purpose. You're probably never leaving this on the table, meaning you absolutely have to take Sacrifice or Protection, and you might say, oh, you should be taking those anyway, but at what point are we no longer even talking about talent tree and just, you know, talents that you have to take, which defeats the purpose of it being a tree, in my opinion. It also offers one of the worst decision nodes that you could have. Sacred Strength increases your spenders by 2%. I'm super sure that there are people that take Sacred Strength over Divine Purpose. I think if this were 5%, you'd have a better deal. I think this is the weakest decision node probably in the game. Holy Aegis is armor and crit by 4%. I really don't like stats in the class trees. This used to be 2 points, now it's 1, so people probably feel a little bit better about it. Improved Blessing of Protection gives you cooldown reduction on Pop and Spell Ward. Spoilers, Blessing of Protection and Spell Ward still share a cooldown, which is super lame, especially now that they are their own 2 individual choice nodes. My hand's in the air. I think that's awful. Then you have a Blessing of Sacrifice choice node, which is like, okay, Sacrifice of the Just brings sack down to a 1-minute cooldown, which is awesome. And then you can also just choose to take Recompense, which is throughput increase based on the Blessing of Sacrifice you cast. I gotta imagine the Wowhead build has Recompense taken because it's technically the most damage, but promotes the idea of using a button suboptimally just for damage. That is a decision, and I like it when players get to make decisions. So, you know, maybe I like that more than I thought I did. But then below that, you do have another choice node for Blessing of Sacrifice. And I think this one's cool. Worthy Sacrifice. I'll be honest, I take this in farm raid all the time with the cooldown reduction on it. It just automatically gets thrown out there. Just a little tankiness for your raid, right? You also have the other half of this choice node, and I think this is super interesting because you have something that you don't see really outside of Prop Paladin, right? Causes sack to remove poisons and diseases, and not only is that like a secondary dispel, but it also prevents poisons and diseases for the duration of Blessing of Sacrifice, which is up to 12 seconds. I think that's super cool. That's a utility you don't find anywhere else in the game other than Blessing of Spell Warding, unless it's a personal defensive. But this is you being able to give somebody else an immunity to poison and diseases. I think unique stuff in the game is cool. So thumbs up, great talent there. But if you don't want that, you can also just not spec into it, or even take Worthy Sacrifice that allows you to get value out of your Blessing of Sacrifice, even if you don't want to press that button. I think that's cool and speaks to accessibility, right? A lot of talents here feel underwhelming, which is good, I guess, because you have Seal of Might, and you kind of have to spec into 4% Mastery and 4% main stat. Like, there's no way you're not taking this. Effectively mandatory. Then you have Of Dusk and Dawn. Mandatory talent for certain when you're talking about the context of all this stuff. I guess down here you do want to have powerful talents, and given how bad most of the class tree is down here, sure, whatever. Lightbearer is another drip healing talent, but at least feels kind of thematic. If you're a prop paladin and you're in a raid, I guess that's 6 drip healing talents that when you add them all up, they'll just serve to kind of take away numbers from your healers in a raid. And then you have Zealot's Paragon, which is Hammer, Wrath, and Judgment damage, and they extend Avenging Wrath by half a second each time you cast them. One thing I will say about Of Dusk and Dawn, and certainly Zealot's Paragon, is that people who are playing their class correctly and quickly do get more value out of them. You know, I like you playing correctly kind of creates the snowball effect of you getting more powerful, right? That said, that's 3 points, 5 points when you take in Seal of Might that you pretty much are speccing into no matter what. Blessed Calling is 15% more movement speed on blessed targets. I like this better than the drip healing options, at least. It further increases Unbound Freedom and gives you a little additional utility when you Blessing Protection or Spell Warding someone. And big fan of Lead the Charge. It gives you 3% movement speed, but also gives your allies 3% cooldown reduction on their movement speed abilities every time you use Charger. This isn't going to be a game changer, but this is going to, again, thematically, you are providing a little bit more utility to your allies. When you do have 2 charges, there might be scenarios where that 6 seconds could add up to be meaningful in some way. Otherwise, it's more of a feel-good talent that does give you a good personal benefit. I'm basically giving the hero and spec tree a day off here. There are certainly problematic details about the spec trees, even in DPS trees. That's just me talking about things that I don't like about the current iteration of, at very least, the class trees. I think they're bloated. I think people already don't design their own talent trees, and you could probably take half the talents out of here and accomplish the same thing that we're currently doing. You know, we have a new expansion coming, nothing set in stone for that for certain. Hopefully they can clean these up a little bit. If not, it's not the end of the world, but I would like to see some change there. I think there's a lot of room here to encourage people to interact with the talent trees a little bit more than just copy-pasting loadouts from Wowhead. I home cook all of my underpin specs, that's why some of them are so bad, but tailored specifically to that fight, right? Or Zekfir for that matter. And the same thing is going to apply in Season 3. Let me know your thoughts on the current talent tree situation in WoW. Like the video if you liked it, share with your friends. Good luck with your endeavors in Season 3. We'll see you very early on with those Season 3 Delve Boss Guides. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or evening. Peace.